Introduction. If there is one thing that Christians know about their religion, it is that it is not Judaism. If there is one thing that Jews know about their religion, it is that it is not Christianity. If there is one thing that both groups know about this double knot, it is that Christians believe in the Trinity and the incarnation of Christ, the Greek word for Messiah, and that the Jews don't. That Jews keep kosher and Christians don't. If only things were this simple. In this book, the author is going to tell a very different historical story, a story of a time when Jews and Christians were much more mixed up with each other than they are now, when there were many Jews who believed in something quite like the Father and the Son, and even in something quite like the incarnation of the Son and the Messiah, and when followers of Jesus kept kosher as Jews, and accordingly a time in which the question of the difference between Judaism and Christianity just didn't exist as it does now. Jesus, when he came in a form that many Jews were expecting, a second divine figure incarnated in a human. The question was not, is the divine Messiah coming, but only is this the carpenter from Ezra, the one who we are expecting? Not surprisingly, some Jews said yes and some said no. Today we call the first group Christians and the second group Jews, but it was not like that at all. Not at all. Everybody then, both those who accepted Jesus and those who didn't, was Jewish, or Israelite, the actual ancient terminology. Actually, there was no Judaism at all, nor was there Christianity. In fact, the idea of a religion, that is, one of a number of religions to which one might or might not belong, had not come on the scene yet and wouldn't for centuries. By the 3rd century, or even earlier, Christianity became a name for what Christians called themselves. It was passed on to them from the Romans, who used a loan word from the Greek, Christos, and in their mind frame they said, yeah, they're slaves to this Jesus the Christ, this Christos. Christianity became a name for what Christians called themselves, but Jews were not to have a name for their religion in one of their own languages until sometime in the modern period, perhaps the 18th or 19th century. Well, we don't believe that. We think that's incorrect, because the original ancient, very old Galilean Aramaic manuscripts of the Apostolic Church of the East, hidden for 2,000 years, therefore preserved, hidden from Constantine, Roman Emperor, the translator Victor N. Alexander seems to hint at that they, being kosher, etc., didn't want anything to do with the pagans, so they wouldn't accept a pagan name bestowed upon them. Okay, so they called themselves Mashiachai, which is translated in English, followers of the Mashiach, or Mashika, or Messiah, i.e. Yeshua Mashiach, or Jesus the Christ, Jesus the Messiah. So then, what are we talking about? We are not talking about a separate institution, a separate sphere of religion, still less of a faith for Jews. We are talking about the complex of rituals and other practices, beliefs and values, history and political loyalties that constituted allegiance to the people of Israel, not a religion called Judaism. To get a sense of the absurdity of the proposition that Judaism is a religion, the way Christianity is, let the author consider a very recent event, or reflect a recent event at that particular time, right? I was just writing on this book. In March 2011, the New York Times published the results of a social scientific study of satisfaction with life among various groups in the United States. Asian Americans were considered to be the happiest ethnic group, while Jews were considered to be the happiest religious group, thus leading to the inexorable conclusion that Asian American Jews were the happiest folks in America. This result is obviously flawed, because we all sense that both Jews and Asian Americans are ethnicities, whereas Christianity is never considered as an ethnic category at all. In fact, for us, Jewishness is a very mixed category that doesn't really map onto either ethnicity or religion alone. This has a good historical basis. As Paula Fredrickson had recently written, in antiquity, cult is an ethnic designation. Ethnicity is a cultic designation. That remained a case for Jews right up into modernity and to a not considerable extent remains so even now. In this book, the term Judaism will be used as a convenience to refer to that part of Jewish life that was concerned with obedience to God, worship and belief, though the author recognises that the term is an anachronism. The temple in Jerusalem was one of the most impressive cultic centres of the ancient world and famous throughout the known world for its splendour and magnificence. As opposed to most other peoples who had many cultic centres, the Israelites performed all of their sacrifices at one place, the temple in Jerusalem, for centuries, from Josiah's reform in the 7th century BC until the Second Temple was destroyed in AD 70, at least officially. When the temple was extant, most Jews organised their religious lives around its festivals and rites, its priests and practices. Distant Jews in Alexandria and similar places sent in donations. At least in principle, all Israelites were expected to make a pilgrimage to the one temple in Jerusalem 3 times a year to celebrate the great festivals. This provided an organising and joining principle for all the people, transcending many disagreements and diversities. Even this, however, was not always the case, as there were groups, such as the people of the Dead Sea Scrolls, or the Essenes, who rejected the Jerusalem temple as corrupt. Once the temple was destroyed in AD 70, however, all bets were off. Some Jews wished to continue sacrifices as best as they could, while others rejected such practices that were important in temple times were still to be practiced, while others thought they were irrelevant. There were, moreover, different interpretations of the Torah, different sets of ideas about God, different notions of how to practice the law. In Jerusalem, which had been refounded by priests and teachers, scribes, returned from the Babylonian exile, 538 BC, new religious ideas and practices had been developed, many of them adopted by a group called the Pharisees. Where did they adopt them from? Probably while in Babylonia, in exile. These Pharisees were apparently rather aggressively promoting these ideas among Jews outside of Jerusalem, who had different traditional practices, the so-called people of the land, those who had not gone into exile in Babylonia. So, being religiously Jewish then was a much more complicated affair than it is even now. There were no rabbis yet, and even the priests in Jerusalem and around the countryside were divided among themselves. Not only that, but there were many Jews both in Palestine and outside of it, in places such as Alexandria and Egypt, who had very different ideas about what being a good, devout Jew meant. Some believed that in order to be a kosher Jew, you had to believe in a single divine figure, and any other belief was simply idol worship or idolatry. Others believed that God had a divine deputy or emissary or even son, exalted above all the angels, who functioned as an intermediary between God, as a middleman between God and the world and creation, revelation and redemption. Many Jews believed that redemption was going to be effected by a human being, an actual hidden scion of the house of David, and Anastasia, who at a certain point would take up the scepter and the sword, defeat Israel's enemies, i.e. Rome, etc., and return her to her former glory. Others believed that the redemption was going to be effected by that same second divine figure mentioned above, and not a human being at all. And still others believed that these two were one and the same, that the Messiah of David would be the divine Redeemer, as the author has already said, a complicated affair. While by now almost everyone, Christian and non-Christian, is happy enough to refer to Jesus, the human, as a Jew, the author wanted to go a step beyond that. He wished us to see that Christ too, the divine Messiah, is a Jew. Christology, or the early ideas about Christ, is also a Jewish discourse, and not, until much later, an anti-Jewish discourse at all. Many Israelites at the time of Jesus were expecting a Messiah who would be divine and come to earth in the form of a human. Thus, the basic underlying thoughts from which both the Trinity and the Incarnation grew are there in the very world into which Jesus was born, and in which he was first written about in the Gospels of Mark and John. You may well wonder why these distinctions, drawn from a very distant past, should matter to anyone in the present day. One difference that the author expects this discussion to make is that Jews and Christians will need to begin to tell different stories about each other in the future. On one hand, Christians will no longer be able to claim that Jews willfully as a body rejected Jesus as God. Such beliefs about Jews have led to a deep, painful and bloody history of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. Many ancient Jews simply accepted Jesus as God, and they did so because their beliefs and expectations had led them there. Others, while holding similar ideas about God, found it hard to believe that this particular seemingly undistinguished Jew was the one they were waiting for. On the other hand, Jews will have to stop vilifying Christian ideas about God as simply a collection of un-Jewish, perhaps pagan, in any case bizarre fantasies. God in a human body indeed. Recognizing these ideas as deeply rooted in the ancient complex of Jewish religious ideas may not lead us Jews to accept them, but should certainly help us realize that Christian ideas are not alien to us. They are our own offspring, and sometimes perhaps among the most ancient of all Israelite Jewish ideas. On the other hand, certain kinds of modern liberal Christian apologists, such as Philip Pullman, the author of his Dark Materials, will have to stop separating out a good Jesus from a bad Christ. The author suggests that Jesus and Christ were one from the very beginning of the Jesus movement. It won't be possible any longer to think of some ethical religious teacher who was later promoted to divinity under the influence of alien Greek notions, with his so-called original message being distorted and lost. The idea of Jesus as divine human Messiah goes back to the very beginning of the Christian movement, to Jesus himself, and even before that. Checklists and families, Christians and non-Christian Jews. The term Christian Jews and non-Christian Jews that the author distinguishes throughout this book might be surprising to people who think of Christians and Jews as opposites, but if we look closely at the first few centuries after Christ, we begin to see that this is precisely the way we ought to view the history of the religion of the Jews at that time. Before we get there, however, it may be helpful to challenge some of our closely held assumptions about what religions are. For moderns, religions are fixed sets of convictions with well-defined boundaries. We usually ask ourselves, what convictions does Christianity forbid, or what practice does it require? We ask similar questions in regard to Judaism, Hinduism, Islam and Buddhism, the so-called great religions of the world. Such an understanding, of course, makes nonsense of the idea that one could be both a Jew and a Christian, rendering it just a contradiction in terms. Jews don't fit the definition of Christians, and Christians don't fit the definition of Jews. There are simple incompatibilities between these two religions that make it impossible to be with. The author argues in this book that this conception just doesn't always fit the facts, and specifically that it doesn't represent well the situation of Judaism and Christianity in the early centuries at all. We usually define members of religions by using a kind of checklist. For instance, one could say that if someone believes in the Trinity and incarnation, she is a member of the religion, she or he is a member of the religion Christianity, but if she or he doesn't, she or he isn't a proper member of that religion. One could say, conversely, that if someone does not believe in the Trinity and incarnation, then he is a member of the religion Judaism, but if he or she does believe in those things, he or she isn't. One could also say that if someone keeps the Sabbath on Saturday, eats only kosher food, and circumcises his or her sons, she is a member of the Jewish religion. But if she doesn't, or he doesn't, she is or he is not a member of the Jewish religion. Or conversely, again, if some group believes that everyone should keep the Sabbath, eat only kosher foods, and circumcise sons, they are not Christians. But if they believe that these practices have been superseded, then they are Christians. This is, as the author has said, our usual way of looking at such matters. However, this manner of categorizing people's religions runs into difficulties. First, someone has to be making the checklists. Who decides what specific beliefs disqualify a person from being a Jew? Throughout history, these decisions have been made by certain groups of people or individuals and are then imposed on other people, who may, however, refuse unless the deciders have an army. It's a little bit like those race checklists on the census forms. Some of us simply refuse to check a box that defines us as Caucasian or Hispanic or African American because we don't identify that way, and only laws and courts or an army could force us to if they chose to. Of course, it will be asserted that the decision about Jews and Christians, not Americans, were made by God and revealed in the scripture, or that by this prophet or that, but this is a matter of faith, not of scholarship. Neither faith nor theology should play a role in the attempt to describe what was as opposed to what ought to have been according to this religious authority or another. Another big problem these checklists cannot address has to do with people whose belief and behaviours are a blend of characteristics from the two lists. In the case of Jews and Christians, this has been a problem that simply won't go away. For centuries after Jesus' death, there were people who believed in Jesus' divinity as the incarnate Messiah, but he also insisted that in order to be saved, they must eat only kosher, keep the Sabbath as other Jews do, and circumcise their sons. Here was an environment where many people, it would seem, thought that there was no problem in being both a Jew and a Christian. Moreover, many of the very items that would form the eventual checklist of being a Jew or being a Christian did not at all form a border line at that time. What shall we do with these folks? For quite a number of generations after the coming of Christ, different followers and groups of followers of Jesus held many different theological views and engaged in a great variety of practices with respect to the Jewish law of their ancestors. One of the most important arguments had to do with the relation between the two entities who would end up being the first two persons of the Trinity. Many Christians believe that the Son or the Word, Logos in the Greek, was subordinate to God the Father and even created by Him. Others believe, this is what supposedly what the Jehovah's Witnesses believe, that God created the Son. Many Christians believe that the Son or the Word, Logos, was a subordinate to God the Father and even created by Him. Others believe that while the Son was uncreated and had existed from before the beginning of time, He nonetheless was only of a similar substance to the Father. A third group believed that there was no difference at all in substance between the Father and the Son. There were also very sharp differences in practice between Christian and Christian. Some Christians kept much of the Jewish law, or all of it. Some kept some rules but dropped others, for example the apostolic rule of Acts. And still others believed that the entire law needed to be overturned and discarded by Christians, even those born Jews. Finally, there were Christians who held that Easter was a form of the Jewish Passover, suitably interpreted, with Jesus as the Lamb of God and Paschal sacrifice, while others vigorously denied such connections. These had an analogue in practice as well with the former group of celebrating Easter at the same time as the Jews celebrated Passover, while the latter just as rigorously insisted that Easter must not be when the Jews hold their Passover. There were many other points of conflict as well. Until early in the 4th century, all of these different groups and diverse individuals called themselves Christians, and quite a few called themselves both Jews and Christians as well. Is that what the Messianic Jews, Christian Jews, are trying to do? Who knows? Checklists and the imperial religion. The checklist approach to make it an absolute divide between Christian and non-Christian, between Jew and non-Jew, came into its own under the Christian Roman Empire, which set much store in getting all the messiness sorted out. For many years it was believed that an early period of fluidity came to an end in a definitive parting of the ways that took place in either the 1st or 2nd century. The argument was twofold. On the one hand, the temple had been such a unifying force that other forms of diversity were much more tolerable without threatening the core of Jewish identity. Following the destruction of the Jerusalem temple by the Romans in AD 70, other ways had to be produced to secure such identity. Hence, the invention of a Jewish orthodoxy that excluded followers of Jesus. On the other hand, we are told that it was the divergence of Christianity from that core that drove an early parting of the ways. The author contends that such diversity did not end with the destruction of the temple and continued well beyond this event. Many have thought until recently, and some still do, that it ended with the Council of Yavne, which initially took place in AD 90 or so. According to a certain interpretation of a Talmudic legend, this was a great Jewish ecumenical council, something like the great Christian ecumenical councils of the 4th and 5th centuries, in which all sectarian differences were abolished. All Jews agreed to follow the Pharisaic rabbinic tradition, and those who didn't were expelled and left the Jewish polity. But this view has largely been discredited by recent scholarship. It was invented by scholars more or less on the model of the great late ancient Christian councils during which Christian orthodoxy was promulgated, especially the famous Council of Nicaea and its successor, the Council of Constantinople. In 381 at Constantinople, the definitive step in cleaning up the differences based on a half-century of negotiations following the Council of Nicaea was taken. In 318, The newly Christian Emperor Constantine had called an ecumenical council of bishops from all over the Christian world to come to Nicaea, present-day Iznik in Turkey, to sort all of this out and restore peace to the Christian churches and communities, following a great deal of dissension, conflict and bitterness between them. Some of the major issues addressed at Nicaea were matters of creed, such as the precise definition of the relationship between the Father and the Son. Others were matters of practice, such as the correct date of Easter and its relationship to the Jewish Passover. It was here at Nicaea that on the first question it was decided that the Son was consubstantial with the Father, that is, they are two persons of the exact same divine substance. Easter was severed once and for all within Orthodox churches from its calendrical and thematic connections with Passover. In the end, what was accomplished in Nicaea and Constantinople was the establishment of a Christianity that was completely separated from Judaism. Since Christianity could not define its borders on the basis of ethnicity, geographical location, or even birth, finding clear ways to separate itself from Judaism was very urgent, and these councils pursued this end rigorously. This had the secondary historical effect of putting the power of the Roman Empire and its church authorities behind the existence of a fully separate Orthodox Judaism as well. At least from a juridical standpoint, then Judaism and Christianity became completely separate religions in the 4th century. Before that, no one, except God of course, had the authority to tell folks that they were or were not Jewish or Christian, and many had chosen to be both. At the time of Jesus, all who followed Jesus, and even those who believed that he was God, were Jews. The decisions that were made in Nicaea had the effect as well of driving a powerful wedge between traditional Jewish beliefs and practices and the newly invented Orthodox Christianity. By defining the Son as entirely on an equal footing with the Father, and by insisting that Easter had no connection with Passover, both of these aims were realized. Between Nicaea and Constantinople, many folks who considered themselves Christians were written right out of Christianity. Christians who practiced Judaism, even only by holding Easter at Passover, which included practically the entire Church of Asia Minor for a few centuries, especially were declared heretics. Nicaea effectively created what we now understand to be Christianity, and oddly enough, what we now understand as Judaism as well. Across the 7 decades between the councils of Nicaea and Constantinople, options for ways of believing or being Christians were cut off through this process of selection, especially the option to be both Christian and Jews at the same time. So, the author down here states what we now understand to be Christianity, and oddly enough, what we now understand as Judaism as well. It was basically recreated. There was a new one created. Nicaea effectively created what we now understand to be Christianity. Okay, so it's a different form, of what the disciples, or what Jesus preached, taught, etc., and what the disciples and the latter apostles spoke of or spread, right? That's what it's saying there, according to this author. It's very different. So today's Christianity is very different from that. Nicaea and Constantinople options for a way of believing or being Christians were cut off through this process of selection, especially the option to be both Christian and Jew at the same time. One could not both believe in Jesus and go to synagogue on Sabbath. We won't let you. Also, say the Nicene rulers of the church, one must believe that the Father and the Son are separate persons, but of exactly the same substance. God from God, as the formula goes. If you don't say these rulers, you are not a Christian but a Jew and a heretic. This strenuous effort to make the separation absolute were further productive of a great deal of anti-Jewish discourse at the time, and continuing almost to our own day, nor is it quite dead yet.